Here I was, living a new life up in the hills, overlooking a beautiful, snow-filled valley, far from any touch of civilization. This was my third winter since I disappeared. I'd better explain a bit. My name is John Martin, though it has changed so many times that I almost forgot what my mother named me when I was born. I was the usual clueless spouse. My wife of 15 years had been in love with another man, Lou Amico, for longer than we had been married. She had married me to provide the stability Lou couldn't, like a home and a steady income, all while maintaining her relationship with him. Lou was already married to the daughter of the local crime boss. The father-in-law didn't mind if my wife's lover had someone on the side, but Lou could never hurt his daughter. I discovered the affair when my daughters were injured in an auto accident. The hospital called to inform me of the accident and asked if I could donate an organ to help save my younger daughter's life. After testing, they told me I wasn't a match. I wasn't related to her. My other daughter was also injured and couldn't withstand the stress of a donation. We needed to contact my wife, but she was out of town at a 2-week-long conference that turned out to be non-existent. Her phone was off. My daughter Kim died that weekend because we couldn't find a donor quickly enough. I had DNA tests done on my other daughter while she was in the hospital, and as I suspected, she wasn't my child either. When I shared this information with my daughter Angie, she realized that her mother had deceived her for her entire life and, in doing so, had caused her sister's death. She asked me to ensure her mother never saw her again and wanted to live with me. Let me back up a bit to tell you about my job. While in the Army, they discovered my knack for analyzing data, leading me to the intelligence section. It was there that my real abilities came to the surface, eventually catching the attention of the CIA. They offered me a contract job with the requirement of secrecy. It would have been foolish to turn it down, so I became a spook, working for a front company and learning to hack into computers. I excelled at it and, 10 years later, was one of the best in my field. My wife had no idea what I really did. All she knew was that I worked in an office and that our joint checking account never ran dry. After the accident and the DNA test results, I contacted my CIA boss. I explained everything and told him I needed to disappear or I might harm my wife when she returned. I never realized how quickly the CIA could act. 3 days later, my daughter and I were on a private company jet heading west toward a new life. My old life was over. The bank accounts and credit cards vanished without a trace. There was no indication that my daughter and I ever existed. One night, the home where I had raised my family burned to the ground. The agency eliminated everything. It was unfortunate that my cheating wife wasn't home when it happened. I can only imagine her reaction when she returned, finding her cell phone wouldn't work, no one was at the airport to pick her up, and all that remained was the basement. She was left with nothing, exactly what she ended our marriage with. My daughter and I were given new identities as John and Julie Martin and settled on a ranch in Montana. The house was almost 3,000 square feet on 350 acres of beautiful land, set up for me to continue my work for the CIA. They kept up the maintenance so I could continue my tasks in peace. My cover story claimed I was a retired author needing tranquility to write my novels, with a reputation for being successful. My daughter enrolled at a state college and loved it. I missed her company, but my work kept me busy. Remember when I mentioned I was a skilled computer hacker? Well, somehow, all the financial records for Lou's father-in-law, the crime boss, started printing out on the FBI's Organized Crime Division's printers. The FBI now knew where to look and went right to work. 1 month later, all crime organizations' assets were seized, many people were arrested, and a divorce was initiated. That's right, a divorce between the son-in-law and his wife. It seemed she received reports of all her husband's affairs over the years, along with his financial records, including hidden and offshore account numbers. Her attorney had a field day. Lou's body was later found in a ditch, and my wife was never seen again. I often wondered if she had escaped in time before the mob found her and took her life. My daughter never knew what happened to her mother, nor did she ask. Her resentment ran that deep. My second winter on the ranch was tough. I was snowed in for weeks at a time. One night, while watching the snow with the outside spotlights on, I noticed a movement at the edge of the light. Nervous that someone seeking revenge had found me, I was surprised to see it was a very large timber wolf. He must have weighed at least 150 pounds and stood 48 inches tall at the shoulders. He looked as if he were in trouble and in desperate need of food. The harsh winter had taken its toll. Just the day before, I had dragged a road-killed deer to my barn to see if there was any salvageable meat. I made a quick decision to share the deer with him. He seemed to need it more than I did. Knowing better than to be reckless, I turned on all the outside lights controlled from the house. Then I grabbed one of my rifles and my .50 caliber Desert Eagle pistol. I didn't want to be part of the wolf's next meal. I dragged the dead deer out to the spot where I had last seen the wolf and then returned to the house, turning off the lights before going to bed. The next morning, the deer was gone. A couple of weeks later, the wolf returned. This time, instead of pacing, he was just sitting there, watching my house. I had another deer in the meat locker that wasn't very good. It was old and tough. Thinking it over, I armed myself and went to grab the venison. When I came out, he was sitting about 20 feet from me, watching with one hand on my gun. I began dragging the deer away from the house, and he followed me out to the spot where I had left the roadkill. He never got closer than about 20 feet, always keeping the carcass between us. He wasn't aggressive, nor did he seem afraid of me. It felt more like two old friends taking a walk together. After I dropped the deer, I started backing away when he suddenly barked at something behind me. I turned to find myself face to face with another wolf. The newcomer stood still, looking at my friend. The large wolf began making sounds toward the newcomer, who then backed away and circled to his side. I realized the newcomer was a female, likely the mate of my alpha male. I did what any sensible human would do when confronted by two wolves. I got out of there. As I backed away, I noticed they didn't immediately start eating. Instead, they worked together to drag the deer into the woods. Later that day, I emailed my daughter at school, explaining about the wolf. I told her to call me before coming home so I could ensure the wolves were gone before her arrival. The wolf visited me a few more times that winter. While never really friendly, we reached an understanding. I let him have some meat when he visited, and he left me alone otherwise. To be fair to him, he never came looking for handouts unless the weather was really bad and he couldn't hunt, and he never asked for more than he could carry. One afternoon, while walking and enjoying the spring air, I spotted my friendly wolf watching me from a distance. I was far from the house but still had my Desert Eagle with me. He greeted me with some wolf sounds, not aggressively but almost playfully. Then he looked at me and started walking away. When I didn't follow, he returned and repeated the ritual a few times until I realized he wanted me to follow him. So off we went, him leading and me following. About 10 minutes into the woods, we stopped at a small clearing where his mate was feeding their young. There were two wolf pups with their mother. My alpha male approached her, nuzzling and licking her, as if showing me his family. I slowly sat on the ground and watched. So, this was what I had been feeding all winter. I felt glad to have helped them survive. Soon, the pups finished nursing and began exploring their surroundings. One of them noticed me and was curious about what I was. Remembering the old saying about not getting between a mother and her offspring, I felt more than a little nervous. I figured if I lived through this, I'd still need to change my underwear when I got home. Then the strangest thing happened. The alpha male wolf approached me, laid down, and rested his head on my leg. The pup climbed up and fell asleep on my lap. After a few minutes, I began to gently scratch the pup's head. The alpha watched my every move but didn't intervene. An hour later, the pup awoke and returned to his mother, while the alpha male stayed beside me. He placed his head back on my legs and closed his eyes, demonstrating a surprising trust. I felt both honored and a bit uneasy. Throughout the summer, I continued to visit the wolf family, and they would come to see me too. It was during my third winter on the ranch that a harsh January blizzard trapped us for a week, leaving 4 feet of snow on the ground and drifts over 8 feet high. My house was self-sufficient, equipped with generators, propane tanks, satellite phones, and a month's worth of food, so I wasn't worried. As I watched the storm through the window, I was captivated by the fury of nature outside. Then, to my surprise, I saw the alpha male wolf at my front door, acting more urgently than ever before. He had never come so close before, but this time, he seemed to need my help. When I opened the door, he stepped inside and nudged the door closed behind him. He carried my coat, hat, and gloves to me, barking insistently. Realizing he needed me to hurry, I quickly dressed and followed him outside. He led me to the barn, expecting me to open the door. When I did, he directed me to my snowmobiles, insisting I take the one with the trailer attached. As I started the snowmobile, he brought horse blankets to the trailer and seemed very focused on his mission. When I followed him, he led me across the fields toward the highway, carefully picking a path that was clear for the snowmobile and trailer. Suddenly, I spotted 2 dark shapes in the snow ahead, bodies. The wolf rushed up to them, barking and tugging at them. I pulled the trailer closer and realized they were 2 women, still alive but barely conscious. I lifted the larger one into the trailer, and the smaller one, presumably her daughter, followed. The wolf climbed in with them, wrapping his body around them for warmth. I drove the snowmobile home as quickly as I could, and once we reached my porch, I brought the women inside to warm them by the gas fireplace. The wolf took a wall-hung rug and dragged it over to me while I peeled off their frozen clothing. Once wrapped in blankets and the rug, the wolf curled up beside them, acting as their protector. I called my CIA contact on the satellite phone, explaining the situation and requesting help. He assured me that assistance would arrive in 30 minutes. True to his word, a military helicopter landed in my yard shortly after. As the team arrived, I greeted them with a bear hug and whispered to them not to make any sudden movements. The look on their faces was priceless when the wolf sniffed one of the men, but they remained calm. Once the wolf was satisfied, the medics could approach the women. It was determined they needed to be hospitalized, so they were loaded onto the helicopter. The wolf watched them leave before returning to the woods, seemingly heading back to his den. A few days later, agents from another branch of the CIA visited me. They explained that the women I had rescued were indeed mother and daughter. The mother's husband had been involved with the mob and was killed after attempting to steal from his boss. In a cruel twist of fate, he was murdered in front of his wife and daughter, who were then abandoned in the wilderness, left to face the harsh elements. I was told that the girls were fortunate I found them. I chose not to mention the wolf. It seemed the government wanted them to stay with me until it could be determined whether they would need to provide court testimony. Afterward, they would receive new IDs and enter witness protection. A couple of days later, my peace was interrupted once again by a military helicopter. The 2 women and their belongings were soon settled into 2 of my spare bedrooms. Once they were comfortable, I called for a meeting in my living room. After introductions, the conversation began. The daughter, Amanda, or Mandy, was your typical outspoken teenager, asking questions and demanding answers. Her mother, Maria, was quiet and shy, responding only when directly addressed, her expression reflecting nervousness. Mandy was curious about their rescue, having heard rumors at the hospital but not believing them. I shared the story of the blizzard, the wolf, and the rescue. Mandy looked skeptical, saying, "I don't believe it." As I contemplated my next words, I noticed their eyes widen as they looked out the sliding glass door onto the deck. I realized the wolf had chosen this moment to appear. I quickly instructed the women not to make any sudden movements or loud noises, explaining that the wolf wanted to check on them since he had played a part in their rescue. He had shown some protective instincts. I decided to follow my usual routine for his benefit and the girls' safety, and I found myself enjoying the warmth of their company. Mandy embraced my hugs with grace, while Maria appeared apprehensive, trembling slightly. I took my time holding her and gently rubbing her back, hoping to calm her down. I asked Mandy to slowly open the sliding glass door and let the wolf in, instructing her to stand perfectly still to avoid startling him. She complied, but her mother tightened her grip on me as if trying to merge into one. The wolf circled around Mandy, sniffing her cautiously. I could see the fear in her eyes, and I spoke softly to reassure her, helping to keep her panic at bay. Once the wolf completed his circle, he walked over to Maria and me. I continued whispering calming words, but she fainted in my arms. I gently laid her on the couch, covering her with a blanket. I pointed outside to the wolf, who slowly walked out with his head lowered. Mandy remarked that he seemed embarrassed as he left, as if he didn't mean to scare her mother. For the next hour, Mandy and I sat with Maria, helping her regain her composure. Over the following weeks, Maria stayed close to me whenever she was out of her room, seemingly relying on me for protection. I could tell she was on high alert, scanning every room we entered. I wanted to help her feel safe around the wolf but wasn't sure how. One spring afternoon, as we sat on the deck, I spotted the wolf emerging from the woods, sitting about 50 feet away and watching us. Mandy noticed him immediately, but her mother remained unaware. I reached for Maria's hand and pointed out to the lawn. When she spotted the wolf, her grip tightened around my hand. I hadn't realized how strong she was. The wolf stood and approached the edge of the lawn, barking a couple of times before returning to his previous spot. Moments later, another wolf appeared, his mate. I identified her to the girls, and to my surprise, 2 smaller wolves followed, running over to the adults and curling up on the grass. I looked at the girls and said, "He's showing us his family. Do you want to meet them?" Mandy eagerly replied yes, while Maria remained quiet. I led Mandy to the edge of the deck, sitting down with her, while Maria stayed at the entrance of the house, hugging herself. The alpha wolf walked up onto the deck and sat beside me, his mate soon joining Mandy and resting her head on her leg. I had to remind Mandy to close her mouth, as her surprise was palpable. Our little family gathering lasted about an hour, during which the alpha wolf gave both Mandy and me a friendly lick on the face before departing with his family. Mandy and I returned to the house, where we found Maria sitting in a chair with a view of the deck. She stood up as we entered and hugged us both, still trembling as she said, "He really likes you too." I whispered in her ear, "He likes you too," and kissed her forehead. It felt a bit unusual, but it was a gentle gesture, reminding me of emotions I hadn't felt in years. As the weather warmed, I began taking evening walks with Maria and Mandy. Mandy loved the walks, and we talked about nature, animals, and anything that came to her teenage mind. Maria remained quiet but held my hand throughout, not in a romantic way but as a gesture of seeking comfort and protection. During many of these walks, I noticed the alpha wolf pacing at a distance. He never approached when Maria was with us, but if it was just Mandy and me, he would join us. The more time I spent with the alpha, the more impressed I became. Having grown up with dogs, I had fond memories of my old English sheepdog, a smart and gentle companion. I enrolled her in obedience school, and she excelled in her training. I still missed her deeply, especially after losing her without any say in the matter. The alpha wolf was far smarter than any dogs I had known. He felt more like a friend than anything else. I grew increasingly concerned about Maria's mental health. She seemed too withdrawn, and her fear of a wolf worried me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break through the shell she had built around herself. I decided it was time for professional help. Using my satellite phone, I started the process, and about a week later, a car pulled into the driveway. A Mexican woman stepped out, introducing herself as Camelia, my new housekeeper and cook. Since I hadn't requested a cook or housekeeper, I assumed she was the mental health professional I needed. When we finally spoke privately, it became clear that was indeed the case. The next time I saw Alpha, I called Camelia over to introduce her. I was surprised by their reaction. She dropped to her knees and opened her arms wide. My great big alpha wolf responded with excitement, wiggling and making friendly noises as he approached her. They embraced, and from that moment on, they became the best of friends. Camelia started bonding with Maria and Mandy, and I began to feel like a fifth wheel. With nothing else to do, I returned to my work. Camelia maintained her role as housekeeper, but I noticed a significant change in Maria within just 2 weeks. The quality of the meals improved, and I appreciated that. My daughter, Julie, was now a junior in college, busy with her friends and a summer job on campus. She wouldn't be coming home this summer, and while I would miss her, I had Mandy to keep me company. Julie often called and emailed, eager to hear about Maria and Mandy, believing they were good for me and expressing interest in meeting Mandy, just in case she ended up being her stepsister. I chuckled at the thought, especially about the stepsister part. After about a month of Camelia's stay, I noticed her taking Maria into the woods with a bowl of meat scraps. When I approached them, Camelia shook her head, signaling for me to stay back. I endured the longest hour of my life, waiting for their return. At dinner that night, Maria excitedly told Mandy about feeding the wolf's pups, and Camelia elbowed me every time I tried to speak. Later that evening, Camelia firmly instructed me to let her do her job and to refrain from interfering with Maria's interactions, including those with the wolf. She assured me that they were making great progress and that my involvement was only hindering the healing process. I couldn't help but feel a bit useless. As summer came to an end, Camelia felt that Mandy was secure enough in her new personality to enroll in the local high school. I drove the 40 miles into town with my niece to get her registered. Given the distance of my ranch and the unpredictable winter roads, it was decided that Mandy would live at the school during the week and come home on weekends, weather permitting. She was the happiest sophomore you could imagine. To celebrate, I took her shopping at the local mall. I kept my lips sealed and let her choose whatever she wanted. By the end of our outing, I had spent $2,000, and I began to wonder if I had made a wise choice. I drove the Hummer H2, and you should have seen how much stuff Mandy packed in it on the drive back to the ranch. As we traveled, she leaned across the seat and kissed me on the cheek, saying, "My real father never treated me as well as you do. I love you." My eyes filled with emotion. It was the best money I could have spent. When I explained this to Camelia, all I received was a big hug and kiss. She simply said, "One down and one to go." As fall began and school resumed, Camelia worked diligently with Maria, finally convincing her to join me one Friday to pick up Mandy from school. Maria was quiet during the hour-long drive, but when we arrived, Mandy was waiting outside her dorm. She immediately grabbed her mom and pulled her in to show her room. With no boys allowed, I sat in the truck while they caught up. About 30 minutes later, they emerged, dragging a very full laundry bag between them. I knew exactly how my mother felt when I came home from college. For the next hour, Mandy took us on a tour of the school, showing us all the great features. Maria smiled from ear to ear the entire time. On the way back, we stopped at a local diner for a bite to eat. Mandy sat across from Maria and me, talking nonstop, while Maria sat next to me, touching my arm and hand. For the first time since I had met her, she wasn't clinging to me as her protector, but rather as a friend. When we returned to the ranch, Camelia shooed me out of the kitchen to do chores while she sat down with coffee to talk to the girls. Later that evening, she patted me on the back and said, "Good job." We had a fantastic weekend, and the ride back on Sunday night was filled with excitement as Maria and Mandy made all sorts of plans for the next weekend. Maria chatted happily, laughed, and even held my hand during the drive. Camelia couldn't have been happier. That week, during lunch, Maria asked me to take a walk with her. A quick glance at Camelia revealed she had heard the whole conversation and was delighted. As we walked, Maria talked while I listened, and we held hands like a couple of teenagers. Toward the end of our walk, I spotted Alpha and instinctively pulled Maria to the side, away from him. When she realized what I was doing, she told me to stop, saying she and Alpha were friends now and that she owed him for saving her life. With that, she dropped to her knees and opened her arms to him. I couldn't believe my eyes as Alpha approached her, just as he had done with Camelia long ago. They played together like puppies, and I felt a twinge of jealousy, unsure if it was for her affection for the wolf or the wolf's affection for her. I planned to talk to Camelia about my feelings that night. The three of us walked back to the house together, Maria positioned between the wolf and me, holding my hand and petting Alpha's ear. She seemed calmer than I had ever seen her. Camelia watched from the deck, grinning from ear to ear. When we got back that night, Camelia informed me that her work was almost complete. She planned a pretend trip to visit her relatives for a long weekend and wanted me to observe Maria's actions while she was away. "One word of warning," Camelia said. "You need to let Maria make every decision, make none for her." She announced her trip at dinner the next day. That night, Maria went to bed early, reverting to her old quiet self. I wasn't sure what happened, but Camelia and Maria had been inseparable all week. By Friday, Camelia winked at me and whispered, "Here goes nothing." At breakfast, she announced that she'd be riding into town with Maria and me to catch the bus to visit her relatives. Camelia had it all planned out. We first picked up Mandy from school and then dropped Camelia at the bus station. Maria had no downtime as Camelia kept her talking the entire trip into town, and Mandy chattered away the whole way back to the ranch. When we returned, Maria was all wound up, as if she hadn't had a chance to relax. The next morning marked her first day on her own. When she asked Mandy and me what we wanted for breakfast, we both replied it was her choice. I noticed a bit of panic in her eyes. It was the first decision she had to make in a long time. After glancing at a list on the kitchen counter, she confidently announced we'd be having ham and cheese omelets. Mandy and I exchanged looks, and while I wasn't fond of omelets, I smiled and agreed. Later that night, I checked the list and saw the omelet was about halfway down the breakfast options. The three of us had a busy weekend ahead, with Camelia having briefed Mandy well, ensuring she kept her mother active throughout. We were supposed to pick up Camelia at the bus station after dropping Mandy off at school. My cell phone rang as we were headed into town. It was Camelia needing extra time at her relatives. I handed the phone to Maria, and she chatted with Camelia until I thought the battery might give out. When they hung up, Maria seemed to be in a better mood. We stopped at our usual diner for dinner, and she sat next to me in the booth instead of across from me. She had a bit of trouble deciding what to eat, eventually picking the first dinner item on the menu. When we arrived back at the ranch, Maria went to her room and didn't come downstairs that night. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of bacon. When I got downstairs, I found she had made pancakes and bacon for breakfast. I complimented her on her great choice, and she beamed. It was clear she was rejoining the world around her and becoming a more active participant in daily life. One afternoon, I sat her in front of one of my PCs and asked for her opinion on one of my stories, explaining that my editor was on vacation and I needed a second opinion. "I'd love to," was her enthusiastic reply. After showing her how the word processor worked, I left her alone to read. Maria stayed focused on the story for 6 hours, and when she finally emerged from my office, she was grinning from ear to ear. "I loved it," she said, giving me a tentative little kiss before heading off to start dinner. Later that night, I checked her edits and found the usual spelling and punctuation corrections, alongside some insightful suggestions and comments. I realized she had truly recovered, but I also knew that soon I would be losing her and her daughter to witness protection. Later that week, a nasty thunderstorm rolled through in the middle of the night. One lightning strike took out a tree in the yard. I got up to inspect the house for any damage, and when I returned to my room, I found Maria cowering in a corner, crying from fright. I took her in my arms and led her to my bed, where we climbed in together and cuddled. Eventually, she stopped crying and fell asleep. I held her the rest of the night, keeping my distance as a gentleman. I finally fell asleep around dawn, only to wake up to the smell of bacon. I opened my eyes to see Maria standing there with a bed tray, smiling as she said, "Please sit up." I made breakfast in bed for us. We sat side by side, eating in silence. After finishing, she rested her head on my shoulder and said, "Thank you. You're the first man I've ever slept next to who didn't try to take advantage of me." She broke down, sobbing, and I spent the next hour just holding her. I promised I would never let anyone use or hurt her again. She hugged me tightly and thanked me, punctuating her words with a kiss that held a depth of feeling I had never experienced before. That day, we spent time together, enjoying each other's company. We did chores side by side, never more than a foot apart, sharing moments that felt joyful and fulfilling. I cherished the time we spent together. It ranked right up there with the happiest moments of my life. However, the worst came that night when I called Camelia. I received a harsh reprimand. She yelled at me for potentially complicating Maria's recovery and advised me to stay away from her. Camelia said she would call Maria in the morning to try to repair any damage. The next day, when I returned from my chores, Maria told me that Camelia had called and that we needed to pick her up at the bus station at 6 p.m. Maria was excited to see her friend, while I felt apprehensive. At 6 o'clock, when we arrived at the bus station, Camelia jumped off the bus, hugging both Maria and me and immediately demanding food, as she was starving. During dinner at the diner and all the way home, Camelia and Maria sat together in the back seat, talking softly. I suspected I was the topic of their conversation. When we reached home, the only request I received was to bring Camelia's bags to her room. The next morning at breakfast, I felt ignored, as neither of them spoke to me. They disappeared into Camelia's room until dinner. That night, as we sat around the table, Maria dropped a bombshell: "I'm leaving with Camelia in the morning. Can you take care of Mandy until I'm well enough to take over? I know she loves you like a father, and I feel you can be trusted with her." I started to protest, but a look from Camelia stopped me. "Of course, I love her like my own daughter. She can stay as long as she wants," I said, my heart torn as I agreed. Later that night, Camelia visited me in my room after I had gone to bed. We had a long talk about my feelings toward Maria and her feelings toward me. Camelia explained that Maria had a long way to go before she could maintain a real relationship. She revealed that Maria had never disclosed her past experiences before, which was an important factor in her therapy. Everything Camelia discussed made sense, but it didn't heal my heartbreak. On her way out, Camelia said, "Call me anytime, and we'll talk. I know this is breaking your heart." How did she know? When I picked up Mandy from school that Friday afternoon, I had a lot of questions to answer. Maria had called Mandy to say she was leaving with Camelia, and I would be picking Mandy up, but no further explanation was given. So, I had a lot to clarify. We talked throughout dinner at the diner and during the ride home. I started by explaining that Camelia was a doctor, not a housekeeper. She was hired to help Maria with her mental health issues. We discussed how much better Maria had become since I hired Camelia and how much Mandy was drawn to her mother. Mandy remarked on how easy it was to talk to Camelia and asked if she could still discuss girl things with her. I gave her Camelia's phone number and reassured her, "Of course she loves you like a daughter." I made a mental note to warn Camelia about potential calls from Mandy. The rest of the weekend went pretty well, except when I found Mandy standing in my office. "There's too much computing power here for just a writer. What do you really do? Do you have too much money?" she asked. When Mom and I were in the hospital, it was a military hospital. We were even transported back here by military helicopter. And then there's that funny phone you have locked up in your desk. I thought about how much to tell her. I looked her right in the eyes and said, "This goes nowhere further. I work for the CIA. I'm not just a writer, that part is just to explain why I live isolated in the hills." Her eyes widened as I spoke. She finally asked, "If I talked about you, what would happen?" "I'd probably be in danger," I answered. She started crying. "I guess I'd better keep my mouth shut. You're too important to me to risk losing." We shared a big hug. I remembered that my long-deceased daughter would be about Mandy's age now if she had lived. Someday, I'd need to have a conversation with her about Kim. All Mandy knew was that I had one daughter from a previous marriage living on campus. While Mandy and Julie were friends, Julie rarely came home except for major holidays, so they never had the opportunity to bond. Kim was never mentioned. I needed to change that if we were going to be a family. Thanksgiving was right around the corner, so I thought a nice family dinner would be in order. I sent Julie an email, inviting her to attend and bring any friends she wanted. I also offered to drive over and pick them up, along with a new car for her to drive back to campus, or to drive her back to college in my H2. You'll never guess which option she picked. As the time to pick them up approached, Mandy and I had a few more heart-to-heart talks. I discussed Kim and her passing, explaining that my ex-wife had cheated on me, resulting in Kim and Julie. I shared that Kim and Julie had been in an automobile accident, and Kim needed a kidney transplant and part of a liver to survive. When I was tested for the transplant, it was determined that I wasn't Kim's biological father and couldn't donate, and Julie was too injured. We tried to contact her mother, but we couldn't find her. Kim died later that day. I then told Mandy about how my bosses at the CIA moved Julie and me out here and arranged to bury Kim's body on a hillside overlooking the creek. Mandy asked if I could walk her out there and introduce her to her sister Kim. I don't quite remember what happened next, but I do recall crying on Mandy's shoulder as she held me, saying, "It's all right, Daddy. I'll always be here to help." I remembered thinking I'd need to explain to her that I needed to marry her mother before she could call me Daddy, but for now, I'd accept the promotion. Mandy and I loaded the Hummer and set off to pick up Julie and two of her friends. It was almost a day's drive, so we planned to spend the night in a motel before starting our return trip. As it turned out, I spent the night in the motel while Mandy stayed in the dorm with her sister and the other girls. I got some funny looks when Mandy called Julie her sister. I gave Julie the "I'll explain" look, and she returned a "damn right you will" look. There were just too many women in my life that night. After getting everyone settled in their beds, Julie and I had a long talk. All I got in return was a simple "thanks for explaining, Dad." At breakfast, I overheard Julie calling Mandy sis. They had started accepting each other. I felt a lump in my throat. Later that day, Camelia and Maria pulled up in front of the house. After being introduced to everyone, the four of them took a walk together. As I watched them walk away, I realized they were headed toward Kim's resting place. I grabbed my pistol and followed them up the hill. By the time I arrived at the grave site, they were introducing themselves to Kim. Watching them brought back very painful memories. I sat down on the ground behind them and started crying softly. I don't know how long I sat there when I felt something by my side. Alpha had joined me, sitting on the ground next to me as he watched everyone at the grave site. A few minutes later, his mate joined us, licking my face before curling up next to me. It was like being comforted by two old friends. After the kids finished telling Kim about themselves, they turned toward me to head back to the house. It was then they saw Alpha, his mate, and me sitting in the grass. Mandy and Julie walked right up to Alpha, hugging them and scratching behind their ears. Camelia, Maria, and the other two girls were a bit more reserved, realizing these were very strong animals but somehow knowing they wouldn't be harmed. While everyone waited, I had a private chat with my daughter, Kim. "I miss you, baby. I hope you liked meeting your new sister." As a group, we all walked back to the house. When we arrived, the girls went inside while the wolves and I walked over to the meat locker. I gave each of them their favorite cuts of venison. It was a somber group I found sitting in the family room. I always remembered Kim as a happy child, always smiling and making jokes, so I sat down with the group and started talking about all the good times I could remember with her. It took me almost an hour, but I had them all smiling again. Later that evening, Camellia took me by the arm and whispered, "I'm going to have to watch you. I feel you're after my job." As she walked away, she playfully patted me on the back, and I felt myself blush. The rest of the weekend went smoothly. When it was time for Julie to leave, I revealed a surprise. I opened one of the barn doors and backed out her new Toyota RAV4. The SUV provided good fuel mileage, dependability, and, most importantly, safety from a father's point of view. Mandy had helped me pick it out, choosing the color and accessories, which were exactly what Julie would have picked herself. Julie expressed her appreciation with a great big hug for her sister. The girls packed up the RAV4 for the trip back to college, promising to exchange emails and phone calls as often as possible. Maria and Camellia soon left as well, but before they did, both hugged Mandy and made her promise to keep them updated about anything going on in her life. Maria walked over to me and said, "Thank you for making my daughter a part of your family," then kissed me as she got into the car. I spotted Camellia grinning from ear to ear. That woman was up to something again, I thought. A few days later, I spoke to my CIA boss and got permission to track down the killers of Mandy's father. I felt a little revenge was in order, first for leaving Mandy without a father, no matter how bad he ended up being, and second, because I suspected the bad guys forced him to allow them to use Maria. That's how they operated. My CIA handlers delivered a file to me about the cartel's operations. I started my revenge later that day. It took about 2 months, but by then, I had broken into all their data stores and started transferring their money around, making it look like each cartel member was stealing from the others. After I had them suspecting each other, I started making public the names of everyone they were currently bribing. The network fell apart, some cartel members were arrested, some killed, and others just disappeared. That drug cartel no longer existed. I had my revenge, and Maria was no longer living under their threat. Christmas was rapidly approaching, and this year it looked like I'd be alone. Julie and Mandy were going to spend the holidays with one of Julie's friends' families, and I was not invited. Camellia felt it was too risky to let Maria visit me. I guess I'd just spend it with Alpha and his family, at least I wouldn't need to bring a plate to pass. As the holiday approached, I sank deeper into a blue funk. I was awakened Christmas morning by the loud sound of a helicopter landing in my yard. A man in a black flight suit knocked at my door and explained, "You are wanted at Langley, sir. Please follow me." We first went to an Army airstrip, and I was escorted to an Air Force jet. The jet was a long-range fighter. I was given a helmet and strapped in as the pilot explained that we would be flying between 60,000 and 70,000 feet at just under Mach speed, with a total travel time of just over 2 hours. Just as I began to respond, he kicked in the throttle, and I was slammed back into my seat, unable to move until he leveled off at 60,000 feet. I glanced at the back of his helmet as he asked, "How do you like that, sir?" As a writer, I tried to express my feelings in the most eloquent way I could. "Holy," I managed, "that about covers it, sir," he replied with a smile in his voice. Military jets don't have in-flight movies, so I occupied myself by asking the pilot about all the knobs and buttons in front of me. Most of the time, he just yelled, "Don't touch that. You'll kill us both." Taking the hint, I closed my eyes and tried to doze off. I must have succeeded, because I woke to the pilot talking to the ground controller, asking for permission to land. After some back and forth, permission was granted, and I felt us heading down. The landing was perfect. I barely felt a thing. We were directed to a hangar where a black SUV pulled up to the plane. My CIA boss got out of the rear door. I figured it must be important if he was here. The ground crew opened the jet's canopy and helped me out. When my feet hit the ground, I turned around to see Camelia and Maria on either side of my boss, grinning from ear to ear. My boss explained that these two wonderful women couldn't bear the thought of spending Christmas without me, so he said, "Get in the SUV, you're all invited to dinner with my wife and me." It turned out to be the best Christmas ever. Maria and I were inseparable all day. Once, after I emerged from the bathroom, I found Maria waiting outside the door. "You were gone so long, I missed you, so I thought I'd wait here for you," she said with a silly grin. Camelia kept a watchful eye on us, but since she was smiling, I guessed I was doing okay. Later, we all sat around the family room discussing various things, and I must have fallen asleep. I woke to quiet and the gentle touch of Maria's hand on my face. I stayed still, pretending to be asleep, savoring the feeling of her hand. "I know you're awake, so open your eyes and look at me," she whispered. When I opened my eyes, I caught her just in time as she leaned in to kiss me, and what a kiss it was. She told me, "Camelia and I are leaving now, and you're being taken to your quarters. Please see me tomorrow if you can. I want to hold you one more time before you leave." We walked hand in hand into the kitchen where our rides awaited. My boss said, "We'll talk tomorrow, some people want to meet you." That night, as I prepared for bed, Camelia entered my room. For the next hour, she updated me on Maria's progress. It boiled down to the fact that Maria was almost ready to join the real world, and my job was to help her without taking advantage of her trust. All I wanted was to be close to her, but Camelia insisted I promise to be good. The next day, I was picked up and driven to CIA headquarters at Langley, where my boss showed me around and introduced me to the team. I felt like a hero of sorts, as my work was highly respected by everyone I met. As the day wound down, I asked if I could see Maria again before I left, but all I received in response was that she had to leave. Little did I know how long it would be before I saw them again. The Air Force returned me, and I resumed my life. Julie's graduation came and went, with Mandy and me cheering our heads off from the stands, while Maria never attended. Mandy graduated from high school and gave the commencement speech. The girls spent every major holiday with me, but Maria never did. To be exact, we never heard from her, no phone calls, emails, or letters in all those years. I even tried contacting Camelia but was told she had been reassigned. My boss never returned my calls about Maria, and I learned in no uncertain terms that she wanted no further contact with me, Mandy, or Julie. We all had a good cry over that. The years rolled past, and one day I found myself walking down the aisle as the father of the brides. Yes, brides. The girls planned a double wedding, and everything went off without a hitch. I couldn't have been happier, but Maria didn't attend, even after we sent her an invitation. About a year later, my boss drove up the driveway, followed by a convoy of SUVs. He took me inside and sat me down, handing me a piece of paper. "I'm sorry," he said. I opened it and began to read. It was Maria's last will and testament. My eyes started to tear as I looked at him. "She's gone," he said. "She passed away peacefully in her sleep after a long battle with cancer. Every time we thought it was in remission, it would return elsewhere. She didn't want you or the girls to see her suffer. You know she loved you all very much. She requested, and was granted, pictures, videos, and reports of all the important events in our lives. Every night, she slept in one of your old shirts, refusing to let Camelia or me replace it, even though it was little more than a rag. That's how much she loved you. One more thing," he continued, "she asked to be buried next to your daughter, Kim. Although she never met Kim, she felt that Kim was her daughter too. It's all in our will." He glanced at his watch and said, "Let's go. They should have her grave ready by now." I don't remember much of the service. I was too heartbroken. The last thing I recall is my boss telling me he would inform the girls and make sure someone stayed with me before leaving me at the grave. After they all left, Alpha emerged from the woods and sat with me. He howled, and I cried all night. In the morning, Alpha nudged me gently until I got up and walked back to the house. Camellia was there waiting for me. She helped me shower and tucked me into bed. The next day, I awoke in Camelia's arms. We held each other close, sharing our grief for Maria in our own special ways. The girls called the next day, saying they would come home next weekend to say goodbye to their mother. Alpha passed away the following year, and I buried him next to my two loves to protect them until I could join them. Now in my late 70s, I feel weary. I sent an email to my boss's replacement. My boss had retired years ago, explaining my wishes. I wanted to be buried with my family on that hillside. I arranged for a headstone and all the details, asking him to ensure my wishes were honored. I then emailed Julie and Mandy to say goodbye, letting them know I was going to join Maria and Kim. With a heavy heart, I walked up the hill, carrying my trusted Desert Eagle. As I lay down and heard the first helicopter approaching, I prepared to find solace in reunion with my loved ones. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.